As part of my need to revisit the major media events of recent history to re-evaluate those events and determine which were relatively legitimate and which were fabricated to whatever degree, I've taken another look at the Sharon Tate murders. In truth, I had never looked at the evidence beyond the mainstream reporting of it incidentally over the years. So, for the most part, this was my first experience with the actual evidence. Everything I thought I knew leading up to this point was essentially sensationalized news of the events. We all know how the news tends to focus on certain elements and oftentimes has an agenda that distorts their reporting of events. So it won't be a surprise to you that I found massive discrepancies or elements of the story that went unreported. But even considering that, I think you'll be surprised at what I found in the conclusions I've come to. I want to thank and give credit to the work of Miles W. Mathis. It was his lengthy analysis that contained the bulk of the clues and outright facts that led me down the paths that I decided were worth pursuing and to my ultimate conclusions. I won't state the title of his paper at this point since it might spoil the surprise, but I will take this opportunity to share his website, which is mileswmathis.com. Miles is an accomplished artist. His artwork greatly overshadows his writing abilities. However, as an investigator and researcher, he is very accomplished. His theories and conclusions, however, are very often hyper-controversial, so a measure of discernment is required as you make your way through his work. Just to cover the basics, I'll begin with a brief background on Sharon Tate. She was born in 1943 and purportedly died on August 9, 1969, during a very different summer than the Summer of Love just 2 years earlier. 1969 marked the death of the hippie free love movement due to a number of things, not the least of which being the Manson murders. Sharon was more of a cult figure because she didn't really achieve the movie star fame by 1969. She was famous for small television roles in the 1960s and for her fashion modeling and cover girl status. Not that it's all that significant in my analysis, but it is an interesting thing to note. Sharon had only appeared in a few movies during her career, and each had an occult or horror theme. She debuted in Eye of the Devil. She was also in Valley of the Dolls and Fearless Vampire Killers. She met Roman Polanski, who directed Vampire Killers in 1967 and married him in 1968. She was said to have been 8.5 months pregnant when she was murdered. You're probably not aware that the Laurel Canyon community in Los Angeles was a hotbed of notable figures in the 1960s, mostly in the music and film industry, and was the birthplace of famous bands like the Mamas and the Papas, the Doors, the Mothers of Invention, the Eagles, Buffalo Springfield, the Byrds, and many others. What connected these people wasn't just their location in Laurel Canyon, but also their almost entirely being the children of military intelligence, or intelligence agency parents. When Sharon is said to have met her end, it was in her Laurel Canyon home. She too was the daughter of an Army officer, and she shared the similar upbringing of moving from city to city as an Army brat. But it turns out Sharon's father, Paul Tate, wasn't just an officer. He was a colonel in intelligence. In 1959, the Tates moved to Verona, Italy, which, by the way, coincides with a major uptick in Operation Gladio activities. In 1962, Paul Tate was transferred back to the U.S. to Fort MacArthur in San Pedro, very close to Laurel Canyon. However, it's speculated that while he may have officially been stationed in San Pedro, he was actually working at the top-secret Lookout Mountain facility, which overlooked Laurel Canyon. If you aren't familiar with Lookout Mountain, it was the secret facility where all the Apollo moon footage and other NASA-related film and photos was processed. It was also the only self-contained film studio at the time. It was said to be where government training and propaganda films were made. Supposedly, more hours of this training and propaganda footage was produced there than what was produced for the public by Hollywood during its entire time in operation. Continuing to build the background for the Tate murders, we'll look at something else I found unusual about Sharon's father, Paul. But first, let's look at a passage from the book Acid Dreams. It was a typical 60s scene. A group of scruffy, long-haired students stood in a circle passing joints and hash pipes. The setting could have been Berkeley, Ann Arbor, or any other hip campus. But these students were actually FBI agents, and the school they attended was known as Hoover University. Located at Quantico Marine Base in Virginia, this elite academy specialized in training G-men to penetrate left-wing organizations. To cultivate the proper counterculture image, they were told not to wash or bathe for several days before infiltrating a group of radicals. Refresher courses were also held for FBI agents who had successfully immersed themselves in the drug culture of their respective locales. Why this factors into our story is that Paul Tate was identified after the purported murder of his daughter, wearing a beard and dressed like a hippie. This triggered what appears to be a scrambled effort to concoct a narrative to explain this anomaly. First, it was reported that Paul had recently retired, 2 weeks before his scheduled retirement. Supposedly, his scheduled retirement was during the very month of the Tate murders. Somehow the story was screwed up by someone who let out that the very reason for his early retirement was because of his daughter's murder. But none of this makes any sense, as Paul was only 46, and nobody that close to becoming a brigadier general would retire so early in their career. In all likelihood, Paul had been dressing up like a hippie and had infiltrated the Laurel Canyon scene since long before Sharon's purported murder. Later, we'll learn more about Paul and how he's also connected to the murders through his and others' strange interest in hair design.
We have a weird homicide.
In a scene described by one investigator as reminiscent of a weird religious rite, 5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Miss Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanski. Miss Tate, who starred in...
Now, in order to really grasp the entirety of the Manson family Tate murders, you should consider the events playing out at that time. There was a very strong anti-war and anti-establishment movement that had grown to become impossible to suppress by the media. There were protest marches happening everywhere, and even active military personnel going AWOL and participating in rallies and marches. As some of you may already be aware, the ruling class never lets things get entirely out of hand, and oftentimes utilizes the media to influence the public to behave in ways more to their liking. As fate would have it, Paul Tate had been transferred to the Presidio in San Francisco just prior to this surge in anti-war activism in 1968 leading into 1969. In fact, the Presidio became a hub of this activity, and anti-war dissidents based at the Presidio started to make an impact, finding powerful people supporting their efforts. Colonel Paul James Tate was Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence at the 6th Region Army Air Defense Command at the Presidio at the time. Another coincidence worth mentioning is that at the same time that Paul Tate is working at the Presidio, so too was Colonel Michael Aquino with the 7th Psychological Operations Group. Are you beginning to get a sense of the players and the playing field that were in place at the time? Now let's take a detour and briefly look at one of the supposed Manson family murderers, Susan Atkins. Susan was purported to be one of the actual murderers, one of the few who got her hands dirty. Even Charles Manson himself didn't actually commit any of the supposed murders. It's interesting to me just to note her physical appearance. She appears quite striking, and even beautiful in some photos. This is supposed to be one of the hordes of women drawn to Manson like moths to a flame. This despite the fact that Manson is 5 foot 3 inches tall, and wasn't known to be that dapper a dresser. We'll look at just one aspect of Susan Atkins' past that causes me to wonder. Susan grew up near where I did, in San Jose, California, and even attended the same high school I did, Lee High School, albeit much earlier. One of the Tate murder victims was coffee heiress Abigail Folger, who has numerous similarities to Sharon Tate. Abigail's family had a farm in Woodside, California that they called the Family Farm, a name which the property still bears today. The family farm and where Susan and I went to high school is only 20 to 30 minutes away. There's even a book about the murders entitled The Family. This is certainly a strange coincidence. Of course, the most important evidence in any murder case is the forensic, physical evidence, including the murdered victims themselves. As I mentioned before, I had not actually researched these events before and don't think I had even seen a single crime scene photo of the murder scene before doing this analysis. You probably recall hearing grisly descriptions of the scene, or if not that, then at least the horrible detail that Sharon's belly had been sliced open and her unborn child tore from within her. So, before I show you any of the crime scene photos, I want you to know that they are as tame as any I've seen. I think they would be considered laughable even to those with weak stomachs. No caution need be issued before showing them. Get ready, and here you go. This is probably the worst of it. As you can already see, Sharon's baby wasn't tore from her womb. So far, it appears as if the baby may have been entirely undisturbed, at least based on the subtle smile on Sharon's face. Other photos of the crime scene are difficult to find, especially any detailed photos of the other 3 victims. However, here's a photo showing 2 victims on the front lawn. Now, some of the more rare photos are of the house pre-murder scene. Here's an example of a photo of the living room. It's very small and low resolution, but you get a feel for how the room was decorated. Does this look like the living room of a wealthy and famous director-actress couple? Looking at a couple other images of the home taken after the purported murder scene only gives me the feeling that they emptied the rooms, then brought in some furniture from the Salvation Army that nobody worried about getting messy. Just look at a couple photos of the home's exterior and see if it matches the furnishings. Making matters even more unusual is the discovery of this photo, supposedly from 1969, showing Polanski at the scene. First, note again the cheap, thinly framed posters on the wall behind Polanski. But even more unusual is the fact that Polanski appears to me to have aged 30 years for this photograph. The Tate murders happened just 6 days before Woodstock. It's also worth noting that the year was 1969, and if the powers that be wanted to put an end to the trends emerging during the 60s and start the 70s off with a clean slate, 1969 would have been the year to do it. The FBI's COINTELPRO was right at its peak, but the lesser-known CIA program, Operation Chaos, was also in full swing in 1969. With Helms running the CIA, Nixon in the White House, and Hoover at the FBI, what are the chances that the hippies were allowed to remain in the spotlight and continue to receive all that good press? I told you we'd revisit the strange connection between the players and hair design. To do so requires us to fast forward to 1971. One of the Manson family's purported victims was a man by the name of J. Sebring, real name Thomas John Coomer. His story is bizarre to say the least. He was a hairstylist to the stars, not only women but men as well. Take a look at this business card and consider this. J. Sebring was a hairstylist, murdered along with Sharon Tate. In 1971, it was reported that Paul Tate had opened Tate Gallery for Men's Hair Design in Rolling Hills, California. I'll go out on a limb and say it's fair to assume that the CIA or other intelligence agency used hair salons as cover for their operations. One can imagine some spook waiting impatiently for his wife to get her hair done and noticing all the women confessing their deepest secrets with reckless abandon. We've been told that when the Tate murders were discovered, it was unknown who had perpetrated the crime. At the time, the Manson family was living rent-free on a movie ranch outside of LA, owned by an elderly and legally blind gentleman by the name of George Spahn. The Spahn Ranch was well known by local authorities to be a magnet for hippies, runaways, and was host to wholesome activities like making porn films, drug dealing, chopping cars, stockpiling weapons, playing loud music and all-night parties. Yet they allowed this activity to continue. All the surrounding properties were bought up by the Transcontinental Development Corporation at very generous rates. But Mr. Spahn didn't sell. In other words, Mr. Spahn was likely being compensated for allowing his unique property to act as a staging ground for Operation Chaos, the Manson family being key players. Returning to the time of the murders that purportedly took place at the home of Tate and Polanski, the investigation was ridiculous and obviously staged with the direct involvement of Paul Tate. I won't go into all the details, but will point out that when it came time for the LAPD to file their required report with the State Bureau of Crimes, it totaled 3 lines. A liquor store robbery would have been more comprehensive. Beyond the crime scene itself and the forensic details, signs of a hoax are ultra apparent as they narrowed their hunt for the perpetrators down to the Manson family. For instance, 1 week after the event, the Spahn Ranch was raided for the first time. Everything about the raid smells funny, beginning with the fact that the warrant they brought with them on the 16th of August was dated for the 13th. But which operative was going to complain? The next red flag that would likely have raised eyebrows in our present time of greater media savvy was the fact that the officers involved in the raid were all dressed differently. Not a single officer wore the appropriate uniform, wearing a mix of sheriff's office uniform elements, Marine Corps fatigues, and civilian clothes. This was way before the era of militarized police, and yet we see some officers wearing combat boots. One officer wears a jacket emblazoned with the word sheriff on the back, which wasn't part of any Southern California Sheriff's Office uniform of the time. Our biggest clue that the whole raid was theater craft was the incredible fact that a film crew accompanied the officers conducting the raid. If you're still thinking that despite the film crew being there to dramatize the event, the intent was still to enforce the law, this point may dissuade you. Despite finding stolen guns, stolen credit cards, numerous drugs, and underage girls, nobody was arrested. Does that sound like the appropriate return on investment of a raid this involved? It should become clear that the events playing out were scripted, and dates for certain milestones pre-selected when you consider that Manson was apprehended at the ranch again just 6 days later for drug possession, fornication, and public nudity, but all of the charges were dropped, and Manson was allowed to go free. The final date of the Manson family's capture was October 12th, which happens to be Aleister Crowley's birthday. As the CIA is often found to use Satanism and occult practices as cover for their operations, this would have been a very convenient date. As we're peeling back the layers of what is now obviously a largely contrived event, what are we to think happened to the supposed victims, like Sharon Tate? Clues to help us with that can be found by first looking again at the crime scene photos of Tate. We've already seen the photo of her slightly smiling corpse, where sometimes the red channel is increased to create the impression of more blood than there actually was. Another photo of the scene shows her in the same pose, said to have been taken between 10 and 12 hours after the murders. Still, her arm is shiny in the photo, indicating it is still wet, which is an impossibility if the photo was taken when they claim it was. But now let's look at a couple photos of Tate while being examined at the coroner's office. This photo is rife with inconsistencies, but we'll look at just a couple that illustrate a point. First, the facial wounds are not consistent with the earlier photos. Second, the marker in the photos could have easily been placed alongside the subject, but is instead tucked under their chin, laying across her breast. Might this placement have been intended to obfuscate the poorly patched head image onto the body? The neck is clearly too thin, and the stark angle produced by merging it with the body is quite obvious. Next, we see another photo from the coroner's examination, where we get a better look at all the circular wounds. Wounds caused by a knife would not have produced wounds of this shape. More interestingly is the shape of the stomach and waist. Sharon was over 8.5 months pregnant at the time of the photo. Earlier photos of her while still alive show her stomach to have grown quite huge. The body in this photo isn't 8.5 months pregnant, and might not be pregnant at all. So it makes sense that neither the death reports nor the autopsy report make any reference to a child or a pregnancy. Outrageous for sure. But remember that this was before the ubiquitousness of the internet and a time of greater trust in authority. Lastly, in regards to the crime photos of Tate, we have the problem of the name R. Wilson, written on the marker seen in the coroner's photos. This isn't the name of the victim, the coroner, or the coroner's assistant. Seeing that the wounds are more consistent with being caused by a shotgun, and the body is clearly not 8.5 months pregnant, might the body be that of Mrs. R. Wilson, who was murdered in LA a few years earlier? If we could become invisible and transport ourselves to the LA coroner's office, I wonder what photos we'd find in the file for the Rufus Wilson murders. To pull off staging the murders would almost certainly require the participation, or at least the complicity, of the local coroner's office. Whoever signed off on Tate's autopsy report was definitely a crook. Does the name Thomas Noguchi ring a bell with you? It might. He was the chief coroner at the time of the Tate murders, and also did the autopsies of John Belushi, Marilyn Monroe, Natalie Wood, and Robert Kennedy, to name a few. Noguchi was definitely a tool of the powers that be. From the events that took place back in 1969, it appears he was an essential element to the operation. On March 18, 1969, the LA Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to fire Noguchi. That doesn't happen every day, so this must have left the perpetrators in a bit of a pickle. But there are benefits to being the ultimate authority in America. So, strings were pulled, and Noguchi was reinstated by the Civil Service Commission on July 31, 1969, only a week before the Tate murders. And if you were thinking the firing of Noguchi in the first place might have been an overreaction, and the coroner's office was otherwise doing an exemplary job, this seems not to be the case. The assistant coroner, Donald Angus Stewart, was arrested in 1972 for forging his medical degree, practicing without a license, and perjury. But none of this matters when the media sets out to whitewash history. While researching the Tate murders and the Manson family, I discovered a bizarre theory relating to what happened to Sharon Tate. As we've already covered, it's possible that Tate and the other supposed victims were never actually killed. If so, what happened to them? Where are they now? Did they assume other identities? Another question I'm now forced to ask is, did Sharon Tate ever return to public life under an assumed identity? Sharon is said to have had two sisters, Deborah and Patty, but I was unable to find any reference to Patty before 1970. The images and film available of Sharon's funeral make the issue no clearer. Patty is supposed to be 6 years younger than Deborah, yet the only photo I found of two girls together at the funeral are simply not 6 years apart in age. There's also the basic improbability that Sharon's mother had Sharon, then Deborah 9 years later, and finally Patty 6 years after that. Patty allegedly died from breast cancer in 2000 and was cremated. Was Patty invented so that Sharon could return to public life in America and assume that identity? Many people admit that Sharon and Deborah look nothing alike, yet Patty and Sharon look at times the spitting image of each other. Patty is said to have married the famous basketball player Don Ford in 1978, yet I could find no photos of the two together. Although there is a gravestone marker for Patty showing the year of her death as 2000, there's no Social Security index record of her death. That's not entirely impossible, but Ancestry.com, Checkmate, and other sites have no records of Patty's birth or death. That is, unless we consider the record in Checkmate's database. The problem there is that if we do, we have to also acknowledge that she is still alive and living in California. The Sharon-Patty connection wasn't all that compelling to me at first. Even after seeing how anomalous and phantom-like Patty was when researching her, there still wasn't enough for me to get behind the theory that Sharon had been alive and posing as Patty. But then I came across the television talk show interviews of Patty, and my position changed significantly. I still can't say for sure if Patty is Sharon, but there was one thing that truly points in that direction. First, we have to look at a couple images of Sharon to see one of her unique features. She has a clear notch in her left ear. It's true that siblings will often look very similar and have very similar shaped ears, but what could be deemed deformities like notches in only one ear isn't something they will share. In 1994, Patty appears on national television for an interview on the 25th anniversary of the Tate murders. She has long hair at the time of the interview and her head turned just slightly so that her left ear details aren't easily discerned. But at one point when she coughs, she lowers her head and turns enough so that we can see her ear. The notch is there. As incredible as it sounds, Sharon may have maintained enough of her youthful beauty to present herself as 15 years younger than she actually was. Like myself, you might still be wondering where Sharon went during the years immediately following the event where she was said to have been killed. It turns out that in the weeks immediately preceding the event, Sharon and Roman traveled to various locations, including Jamaica, Brazil, as well as other locations. It's quite possible that Sharon and Roman were scouting locations where Sharon could take up residence for a short or long period. There is evidence that Sharon was alive after her purported death. In late 1969, someone reported seeing her and Roman in Rome. In the June 1970 issue of the Bulletin, a friend of both Sharon and Roman was reported to have seen Sharon with Roman in Brazil. Keep in mind that this was a friend of Sharon's who not only reported seeing her, but also seeing her with Roman. That's a very specific claim. The fact that it was reported in a tabloid doesn't diminish the value of the claim, in my opinion. I found that some things reported in the National Enquirer were very accurate and likely only printable in such a publication. Other traditional outlets would simply find it impossible to get away with such bold reporting. Although I've chosen not to delve too deeply into the Manson family murder trial, I do think it's important to mention a couple key points. First, as you may already know, Manson never committed any murders that we know of. He is simply said to have, quote, ordered the murders at the Tate Polanski residence. The hype over the Tate murders was rampant in the Los Angeles County area. Yet, when the defense asked for a change of venue, they were denied. Manson also requested that he be appointed his own defense counsel to defend himself. That, too, was denied. Even when the headlines read, "Nixon says Manson is guilty," it wasn't considered worthy of a mistrial. Manson's defense counsel called a total of 0 witnesses during the trial. Lastly, the Manson family trial was the longest and most expensive in American history. Some things to think about. The final element that I will consider in my investigation into the Tate murders is Charles Manson. Again, taking from the excellent research of Miles W. Mathis, I found some excellent points made that should cause anyone to question the whole phenomenon that is Charles Manson. The question that Miles and I both have is Charles Manson in prison or not? There are plenty of reasons to doubt that he is. Let's begin first with some information about the California penal system. In all California prisons before 1998, all beards had to be trimmed to 1/2 inch or less. Since 1998, beards have been prohibited. Are you starting to catch my drift? Here's a photo of Manson, clearly showing the year is 2011. Do you notice that he has a beard? If you do, would you consider it to be over 1/2 inch in length? Next, let's compare a photo of Manson in 1971 to one in 2009. Would you agree that he has had an ear tuck operation? How common is it for prisoners to be allowed to have cosmetic surgery? Who would have paid for such a surgery? Strike two against the possibility that Manson has been in prison all of these years. Then there's the issue of all of the ridiculous interviews of Manson through the years. You've probably seen at least one, but how many have there been in total? Dozens at least. Maybe 100 interviews have been conducted with Manson. He is a very compelling person. Personally, I very much enjoy listening to Manson. I tend to agree with much of what he says. But how much of it is the spontaneous ramblings of a lunatic? Let's examine for just a few minutes his speech entitled Sneakyville. I will tell you first that the voice you hear isn't that of Manson. I don't know whose it is, and have no idea why they would overdub the sequence, but nonetheless, they did.
We are sneaking in the county jail, looking under the door to see if the man is there. Sneaking like little children out of town. Sneaking all around the courthouse. Sneaking in and out of the ventilators, sneaking everywhere. Everything is sneaky up around Sneakyville. Everything we have to do is to get to the truth has to be sneaky. It seems a shame to sneak to get to the truth, to make the truth such an evil, dirty, old, nasty thing. You gotta sneak to get to the truth. The truth is condemned. The truth is in the gas chamber. The truth has been in your stockyards, your slaughterhouses. The truth has been in your reservations, building your railroads, emptying your garbage. The truth is in your ghettos, in your jails, in your young love, not in your courts or your Congress, where the old sit judgment on the young. What the hell do the old know about the young? They put a picture of old George on the dollar and tell you that he's your father, worship him. Look at the madness that goes on. You can't prove anything that happened yesterday. Now is the only thing that's real. You can try to prove that Columbus sailed on an ocean, but it's not the same ocean. It's a different ocean. It's a different world. Every day, every reality is a new reality. Every new reality is a new horizon, a brand new experience of living. I got a note last night from a friend of mine. He writes in this note that he's afraid of what he might have to do in order to save his reality, as I saved mine. You can't prove anything. There's nothing to prove. Every man judges himself. They can play like they stand in judgment and take you off and control the masses with your human body. And they can lock you up in penitentiaries and cages and put you on crosses as they did in the past. But it doesn't amount to anything. What they're doing is they're only persecuting a reflection of themselves. They're persecuting what they can't stand to look at in themselves. The truth.
If the murders did take place as reported and the true perpetrators brought to trial, it would make sense and go a long way to reduce all our suspicion to appoint a prosecutor that was skilled and highly professional. Even a low-key prosecutor just doing his job would lead to greater confidence in the whole process. But it was Bugliosi that got the job. At the time, he had recognition as a top-notch prosecutor, but his profile was nothing like it is today, and they lacked Bugliosi's extensive historical record to reflect upon. I'm not going to place the blame directly on Bugliosi for all of the lies that he certainly perpetuated, lies told to cover up crimes or manipulate the population. I can only speculate as to how much Bugliosi knows and whether he knows what the grand purpose was. My gut tells me that he keeps an intentionally narrow focus to avoid soaking too much of the ugliness and corruption found down every corridor of the institutions he moves in. I think he prefers to avoid knowing the truth and therefore having to lie. Instead, he lies to himself through his expertise at denial built up over the years. But garbage in, garbage out. One aspect I've avoided thus far is motive. Why did Charles Manson instruct his obedient followers to kill anyone in the first place? Vincent Bugliosi has for years been on a desperate crusade to answer that question for you. Although he is only one man and doing the job of a prosecutor, he speaks for the entire ruling class. The answer is HelterSkelter. What Bugliosi has been saying for years is that he was appointed to determine the motive in the case. That's one of the tasks assigned to the prosecutor. He has found that Charles Manson is racist, narcissistic, and moderately delusional. In that condition, he began to project an expectation of racial conflict that would soon flare up in America. That grew into a desire to kickstart the coming race war. Manson then chose false flag murder as the tactic to achieve that. He would order the killing spree, but leave evidence that would frame black Americans for the crime. From there, he would leave it in the hands of white Americans to become enraged enough to go to war against black Americans. Although the motive is somewhat complex, and not the kind most killers tend to get impassioned about, it did motivate the killings, although indirectly through Manson's loyal family members. They committed both the murders at the Tate residence and those on the following night, and left the critical clues smeared in blood before leaving both sites. They would write, "Death to pigs," "pigs," and "HelterSkelter." Charles Manson has always denied any such plot and claims never to have connected the phrase HelterSkelter with any race war scenario. Permitting Manson to testify in his own trial, he said the following with regard to HelterSkelter. The jury was sent out of the courtroom so as not to hear what Manson had to say.
It means confusion, literally. It doesn't mean any war with anyone. It doesn't mean that some people are going to kill other people. HelterSkelter is confusion. Confusion is coming down around you fast. If you can't see the confusion coming down around you fast, you can call it what you wish. Is it a conspiracy that the music is telling the youth to rise up against the establishment? Because the establishment is rapidly destroying things? Is that a conspiracy? The music speaks to you every day, but you are too deaf, dumb, and blind to even listen to the music. It is not my conspiracy. It is not my music. I hear what it relates. It says rise. It says kill. Why blame it on me? I didn't write the music. As far as lining up someone for some kind of HelterSkelter trip, that's the district attorney's motive. That's the only thing he could find for a motive to throw up on top of all that confusion he had. There was no such thing in my mind as HelterSkelter.
Remember years back when George W. Bush and Al Gore were doing the recount of votes and the whole hanging Chad fiasco? Do you recall how everything was resolved, declaring Bush the winner? There were clear decisions made, vote counts recorded, various rulings, and the final ruling on the issue made by the Supreme Court, all of which were measurable factors. But there were other factors where the impact on the proceedings were impossible to measure. The assigned observers from both parties did little to help, and how much harm they may have done is unknown. In my opinion, the power players involved in the battle between parties to have their turn in the pilot seat don't appreciate the process and would avoid the whole election process if they could. I'm not talking about just campaign managers and the Clintons. I think the Supreme Court justices would avoid the election process if they could get away with it as well. If it weren't for the 3-person commission they put together down in Florida to oversee the recounts and all the time generously donated by local residents of the area, we would have seen nothing but underhanded tactics, one after the other. You can bet that the power players keep their finger on the pulse to gauge public opinion on certain issues. The Florida recount situation was a perfect example of a situation requiring tracking of the public pulse. I remember getting a sense from the overall activities and from the statements being given toward the end there that all arguments were exhausted and all deals had become stalemates. All that remained was the will of the people. The majority wanted the election to be systematically worked out and reason to guide the way. However, the pulse said enough Americans would tolerate simply giving up and throwing the election at either candidate. So that's what they did, and they got away with it. The Florida recount was a shock to the system, in my opinion. Sure, they figured out a solution, but I think it required thinking on their feet and quick action. Too much fairness and cooperation had been seen in those first few days after the election that they were required to take action. It wasn't about ensuring their candidate won the election. It was about the will of the people and the need to limit the people's power and awareness. I think it's quite obvious that entire crowds of citizens that had formed to protest the recount were all puppets on the payroll. Seeing those crowds on the evening news each night had an enormous impact on our opinion of the ruling parties, our voting system, and the recount process. If I were to study it in minute detail for years, it's unlikely I would come away understanding exactly how their phony protests operation changed things, changed history. I think that assessment is even more true of the staged Manson family operation. I feel certain that the Tate murders were largely a deception, and part of a larger operation intended to change the public's views on anti-establishmentarianism, the anti-war movement, the counterculture, and of themselves. It's very likely, although not certain, that the purported victims were never killed. It also appears that most or all of the Manson family members who were convicted didn't actually serve out those lengthy prison sentences. Just like a company might conduct a twice-a-year organized inventory, I assume the players in this operation must participate in a sideshow for the media. In the case of Manson himself, there are numerous interviews and occasional parole hearings to attend. Because they are so frequent and it's so important what Manson says, he is likely tied up completely in the project. For others, however, it would not surprise me if they were involved in other operations or doing other jobs. What do people do all day who work in psychological operations or certain intelligence departments? Why, they trump up phony scenarios like the Sharon Tate murder, it appears. Case in point, the HelterSkelter scenario. Bugliosi wrote a 650-page book on it. And take a look at the Wikipedia page on the topic. It's quite detailed. Charles Manson claims he didn't come up with it. But if Manson is part of the team and playing along, why is he contradicting the script? Maybe it isn't really a requirement of the operation. Maybe Bugliosi cooked it up and his higher-ups didn't object. Vincent Bugliosi is said to have died just days ago while I was working on this project. I don't celebrate anyone's death. I'm saving that for Henry Kissinger. But I will say, I'm glad there won't be any more footage of Bugliosi pointlessly arguing this or that with only disinformation fueling the debate.
The truth.